not with us anymore, but his father and his grandfather were big rabbanim in Sunderland, where I studied pharmacy. Rabinovich,
Okay.
descendant of the Bialael.
Uh-huh.
And he was a big Talmud Chacham, very intense guy, very sort of passionate and tended to blow up, So he was living in Sunderland, I was living in Sunderland. The next time I bumped into him, he was living in Jerusalem, and he was coming to Hadassah to get chemotherapy. So I started getting chemotherapy in Tishrei. So it's now 2 days before Yom Kippur, 3 days before Yom Kippur. So I said to him, listen, I said, you realize you can't fast on Yom Kippur. I said, it's dangerous. Don't tell me what to do, break your head,
Let's go.
I said to him, if you fast on Yom Kippur, you should know something. You're committing suicide. You'll go to Gehenna forever. or worse to that effect. I said, I'll take a stick and I'll break your head open. I said, you don't have to fast. So he didn't fast.
Okay.
Fortunately, he lived another 10 years.
Oh, wow. Just because he didn't fast.
So, sometimes you have to be nasty to him.
So, there's two, in Pinchas, there's two Maimarim of Tzavet B'nai Yisrael. The first one is from Tavkuf Samechei, I think, 1805.
This is towards the end of Pinchas.
Right, it's the end of Pinchas, where we find all the sacrifices, the regular sacrifices, not the personal sacrifices, but the public sacrifices that were brought as part of the regular service in the temple. And the second mimer is very, very interesting, because the second Tzavet B'nai Yisrael, meaning command the people and the children of Israel, we'll look at the note here, 126. נאמר בשבת פרשת פנחס, כ"ד תמוז, מברכים החודש מנחם אב תקע"ב.
Okay.
So this was said on כ"ד Tammuz. Today is the 17th of Tammuz. So it was a week from today, and that was a week. I guess it was a week after Shivas Rav Tammuz.
Mm-hmm.
It was said on Shabbos. It's exactly like this year.
Mm-hmm.
This year also. If today's 17, so let's see, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, no, Shabbos will be 23rd. So it's almost like this year. But what's important about this date, the 24th of Tammuz, 1812, וברשימת הצמח צדק, it says, מברכים אב את הכבש אחד, סיום על תורות בליעדי. This was the last essay that he said in Liadi, and a week later, they started running away from Napoleon, from the French. Okay.
He
So
died
no, it took another half year.
Yeah.
So this is the book that Moonshine put out in. You've seen this?
No.
Masah Chalon, the last voyage.
When
And
did that come out?
I didn't know it came out. I suddenly saw it on Shabbos. We were by friends, and I stole it. They gave it to me for.
Translate that into English.
Yeah, no, it's nobody needs it.
Mm-hmm.
You can sum it up in a half-hour lecture.
Mm-hmm.
The rest is more and more documentation, but the point is to sum it up.
Pictures?
He has a lot of pictures, very interesting pictures from, obviously not photographs,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of pictures from Napoleon's voyage into Russia.
Oh,
Tons of stuff. This is the famous burning of the, what do you call it? Every army has the banner.
yeah.
The famous burning of the banners when Napoleon was defeated finally, and he was running away from the Russians already. So they burnt all their banners and all their eagles. The eagles looked something like this. It was very, like all the armies in the world had this. So there's tons of documentation about that part of Napoleon's bid to rule the world, to become another Alexander the Great. And when the French entered, what he brought here that I don't think is brought in many other places, which is unique to this book, is the amount of death and destruction that they brought with them. Meaning, I usually heard that it was the Russians who had a burnt or scorched earth policy, that they thought that was the way to destroy Napoleon. But at least the way that it comes out here, I don't know what the Russians had to scorch. There was nothing left to burn. After the French invaded. Basically, they came from Poland, came from Lithuania, from Poland, and they invaded in the summer of 1812, and they invaded exactly a month before the Alter Rebbe started running away from them, trying to escape from them. And the Alter Rebbe was very much against Napoleon because, for a lot of reasons. But when you see the amount of death and destruction that they brought, the French were supposed to be peace-loving. No, they came to conquer Russia. That's not exactly peace-loving. Napoleon was a maniac, a raving maniac. So even though he talked about the principles of the French Revolution and liberalism and all this and all that, everybody was equal before him. He killed Jews and Russians alike. He didn't care who you were. If he needed the supplies, he killed whoever he needed to kill. And the way out, they say they what was left. I mean, they went out a different way that they came in, and they basically dismantled whole villages. Meaning they didn't. It wasn't like on the way out and the way in, they kicked people out of their homes, so they had a place to be when they were in a village. Remember, there was 600,000 soldiers. It was it's a huge army. So, on the way out,
where did they get 600,000 soldiers?
Yeah. There's a lot of Frenchmen in the world. And on the way out, they dismantled whole villages. Meaning they didn't care to stay in the houses. What they wanted was just the wood of the buildings of the houses to burn for their heat. They weren't interested inside the houses. It was cold. There was no wood to be found. So they took apart their houses. So on the way out, all the villages, they demolished them. They don't exist today because they burned. Anyway, when they came out, they left with 10,000 people. He came with 600,000, and he left with 10,000 soldiers.
That was it.
Anyway, so this is the last essay, the last mimer that he said in Liadi, and it's interesting that we get a chance to learn the very last thing he said there, and after that he said very little. There was very little in that book in Tov Kufayin Gimel, 1813. He on the path when they were running away, he was able to say 4 or 5 short things. They're not full-fledged essays, but they were written down by the Tzemach Tzedek, so we have them too. So this is the very last one. In a certain sense, this is you could say that this is he has something directly against Napoleon. He has something that he wrote, a short thing that explains exactly what his problem with Napoleon is, and it's his. He says this is not a regular war. This is not a war about grievances. It's not a war about misunderstandings. It's not a war about resources. It's none of these things. This is a war about hubris. That's all it is. And he said, apart from the fact that Napoleon erased God from the equation completely, he didn't want to hear any more about God. You know that he changed the calendar in France. That would start from his reign, I think. Meaning. And the Baal Shem Tov was famous for saying that he would never drive, he would never use a driver in his wagon who wouldn't, how do they say it? When they
have an affiliation for his religion.
No, but he wouldn't crucify. How do they say it?
He used to walk past the
church on the roads there were crucifixes, and they would make the sign on their chest. He said he wouldn't drive with somebody who didn't do that, because he said even if it's a mistaken conception of God, even if there's problems with it, but he acknowledges there's somebody above him. And Napoleon, and he writes this, has nothing like that. And he said that this will cause the entire world, and especially he talked about the Jewish people, to lose their feeling of subservience to God. And so today he was absolutely right, because in the end these ideas spread. It's true that Napoleon wasn't the one to finish the job. The job was finished in many other ways. But it wasn't finished. I mean, I don't think that more than 10% of the world today, or 15% of the world today is not religious, like doesn't believe in God. But still, those ideas really started to spread with Napoleon and the Napoleonic Code, which changed the way that most governments worked. So he had a very he didn't just run away from Napoleon because he was afraid of him. He said, I don't want to be under his rule for even a moment. I want to have nothing to do with this. So in a certain sense, this last essay, he already knew. They already knew him. Napoleon had invaded a month before. He was on the move. And so they already knew that this is not going to end well. In a certain sense, what he says here is a summary of his approach to how man should be before God. That's in a certain sense the answer to Napoleon. Even though again, it's not, he doesn't mention him here in any way. Even though this is a week before they ran away from Liadi. Tzav bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem et korbani לחמי לאישה ריח ניחוחי תשמרו להקריב לי במועדו ואמרת עליהם זה האישה אשר תקריבו. I filled in the blanks here, the who. את הכבש אחד תעשה בבוקר ואת הכבש השני תעשה בין הערביים, so on. So the first thing is to understand, he says, that twice it says ואמרת עליהם. It says, command the children of Israel and say to them, my sacrifice, the bread of my fire, okay, you shall sacrifice on time. And you shall say to them, this is the sacrifice that you shall sacrifice. This is the offering that you should bring as a sacrifice. So why did it say twice? Say to them. וגם שינוי לשון דכתיב אשר תקריבו את הכבש אחד וכתיב ואת הכבש אחד תעשה לשון עשייה. So which is it? Is it to sacrifice it or to make it? Two verbs are used to describe the act of offering the sacrifice. Either to sacrifice or to make. It's sort of like aliyah, right? Aliyah is a verb. La'alot. And then people say to make aliyah. to go to the land of Israel. So they call it to make it. It's an interesting thing. There's like something like that in Hebrew also. וגם תקריבו לשון רבים ותעשה לשון יחיד. And the sacrifice, the verb to sacrifice is in the plural, and to make is here in the singular. Okay. So getting to the first question, why does it say twice ve'amarta alehem? Why does it say twice that you should say to them? והעניין הוא כמאמר הז"ל. So the answer is, the sages gave us a principle. They say כל מקום שנאמר צו הוא מיד ולדורות. Every place that it says command the Jewish people, it's saying now, meaning in Moses' generation, and for all the other generations, because not just now. So tzav is like a tying together.
Immediate.
It's saying that there's two different time frames for doing this. וזהו כפל האמירה ואמרת עליהם מיד. והוא עניין הקורבנות שהקריבו בזמן שבית המקדש קיים. ואמרת להם השני, היינו לדורות. So how does he interpret this? He says the two different time frames are now, when there was a tabernacle and then the continuation in the temple. And the second, you should say to them, that's for the generations. That's to say, shetiknu tefillah keneged tmidin. It's a big chiddush. That there's another way to do this, meaning that not at all times will there be a temple. So what do you do when there's no temple? From this, the sages learned, so he says, they learned that the prayers, the three regular prayers that a person says every day, they are in lieu of the sacrifices, the regular sacrifices in the temple, right? And how does that work? So we know how it works. So in the morning there's a sacrifice, and in the afternoon there's a sacrifice. It's shacharis and mincha, and then the parts of the sacrifice. These were both olot; they were burnt offerings, so they had to be completely consumed by the fire, except for the skin, which went to the priests, everything was consumed by the fire on the altar. So it didn't finish, especially the one that was in the afternoon, it didn't finish being consumed by the fire by the end of the day. So it was left on the altar at night. And usually it finished sometime around midnight or something like that. So that was Ma'ariv. And indeed, in the beginning, there was a question about whether Ma'ariv, the evening prayer, whether you have to say, whether you need to daven it in a congregation or whether you can just daven it alone. Because the temple was closed the moment that the sun went down. They closed the gates. Nobody could come in anymore. So it was done in private. This burning of the sacrifice, the rest of the sacrifice overnight. So okay, but anyway, those are the three time frames of prayers, and they correspond to the daily sacrifice. Again, one kevis, one sheep in the morning, one sheep in the afternoon. And so he learns this from vehemently vehemently. Okay, you should say to them. You should say to them. One is talking about the time when there is a temple, one there isn't. So here we got the first connection between prayer and sacrifices. It says in the time that there's no temple, so the prayer comes instead of the sacrifices. Again, instead of the public sacrifices. So the question is, why would there be a connection between them? Right? The Gemara in Brachos, it just says that. The Talmud just says that. It doesn't explain why. Sages didn't bother with the explanation they just say this is instead of this.
It was obvious.
Apparently, it was either obvious or they didn't mean to get into this discussion. Shehen kvasim b'nei shana, v'atfilah bakashat rachamim, v'echi tmuhat korban. The sacrifices, the daily sacrifices, were 2 sheep. How is that even similar to prayer, which is asking God for mercy, for compassion? How does one come instead of the other? גם להבין מה שכתוב בקורבנות, ריח ניחוח, לשון נחת רוח. We also need to understand, in order to understand how they correspond, how one comes inside of the other, the prayer instead of the sacrifices, we have to understand what it means that the sacrifices are a pleasing smell. Okay? Meaning that they give God, as it were, composure, nachat ruach. The feeling that, as it says, that he commanded and it was done. So it's interesting that he doesn't mention this, because the answer that Rashi gives is, why is it nachat ruach? Why does it give me composure of spirit? Why does it give God composure of spirit? Because it says that I commanded and it was done. I had a will and my will was done. Why is that? So what's so special about korbanos? What's so special about sacrifices? That they're connected to fulfilling God's will more than any other mitzvah. Every mitzvah that Hashem gave and that you perform, so you perform the will. So why is it any different? If you put tefillin on, it should also give Hashem composure. But it doesn't say that. It says nachat ruach only about reach nichoach, only about the pleasant smell that came from burning the sacrifice. And that itself needs an explanation. You're telling me that it's such a pleasant smell? It's a pleasant smell if you're very hungry and you want some burnt flesh and you're looking to do a barbecue. Maybe then it's pleasant. But to say that it's pleasant always, it says that there had to be a miracle all the time in Yerushalayim that pregnant women didn't miscarry because of the smell that came from the altar. It was everywhere. So a pleasant smell is very strange. One might say that maybe they had techniques there that we don't. Maybe they did things to the wood that we're not familiar with. That maybe they added, the smell of the incense mixed into the smell and it changed everything. So it could be all kinds of things that they did to change the smell. But on the face of it, just having smell, yeah, if you wanted smell, why not say that it's a doctorate? Mm-hmm. The incense is much more that way, right? When they burn the incense, it's a good smell. So that should have been the thing that really gave God the composure. If you're talking that smell is so important here, because nachat ruach, again in Hebrew, it just means that my spirit, ruach, is my spirit, but it also comes from the same word as smell. So if they're connected, you maybe think that the incense would be more.
Speaking the language of men, it doesn't necessarily
100%. So I'm saying the incense would have been a better example. Okay. one explanation, by the way, is that, of course, the incense is also part of it. I mean, the incense is a type of sacrifice. Okay? It's just that there are sacrifices from the animal world, there are sacrifices from the vegetable world, and there are sacrifices from the inanimate world. So the incense is partly vegetable. So some of the things were things that grew, and some of the things didn't grow. Okay? But in any case, it's mostly a sacrifice from the vegetable world. So it's also a type of sacrifice, even though it's not like you don't. But by burning it, you're doing to it what you did to the sacrifice. So there is an issue here that does join them together, and that connects to smell. And the smell, you would say here, as he's going to explain, is a byproduct of the particular way that this mitzvah, this commandment is done. That it's consumed. The idea of being consumed is what is, according to the Alter Rebbe, what's hiding behind this. Now, he said that my understanding is that here he's talking about what he sees as the remedy to Napoleon's pushing the world into apikorsis, into lack of faith in God. It's a bittul, as we'll see, the act of self-nullification. It's as if you're consuming yourself. That's the answer. Meaning, the world was fine. It was working fine, relatively speaking, but everybody had faith in God, with all the mistakes that were in there and all the problems that were in there. But in the end, everybody was religious, and with religion, you tend to hope that in the end there will be some kind of awakening, that people will see that their religion is not right. There's something wrong with it. They believe in God, but there's something wrong with what we're doing. That was the hope for many, many generations. That's what the Rambam writes. The Rambam writes that in the end, the Christians and the Muslims will realize that there's something wrong with what they've been fed all along. It doesn't make sense. Something about it just doesn't make sense. And then they'll come back to Judaism. Then they'll come back to understand the Yiddishkeit. They'll understand the Torah. They'll come back to the Torah, basically. What if somebody doesn't believe anymore in God? So where do you start the conversation even? So in a certain sense, I think that what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that the conversation restarts with people who don't believe in God, with the need to perform mitzvos. That's how it's different. It's not a philosophical explanation anymore. It's not a philosophical discussion. You would think that with the philosophers, the French encyclopedists and the liberals and everybody who's thinking there, all the thinkers, the philosophers, you would think they would have to have a philosophical conversation and convince them that there's a God. And I think we talked about this, that the Alter Rebbe's approach is no, the mitzvahs are more important than the thinking, than the dat, than the consciousness that you have. Okay. And the moment that it's like saying that man understands, human beings understand that there's a problem with not being subservient to anything. Meaning, if I'm left to my own devices, there are probably 3 people on the planet that will actually lead a decent life. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's 2. Maybe it's 1, I don't know, maybe it's none. Because everybody needs a schedule. Everybody needs something to limit them, because the soul by itself is lost. It has to have some kind of framework to function within. So we create these frameworks through states and this and that. But really, you have to say today that unfortunately what's happened, and this is like the beginning of Zionism, one would say, that nation states took the place of God. That Kafka was really into that. The Castle. I don't know if you ever read it. He wrote it in the beginning when he began to understand that the bureaucracy is not any better than godliness. The only difference is that you can't really believe that the bureaucracy is controlling anything. The bureaucracy is just a mess. So nation states created this thing that you're supposed to believe in called the rule of law and the social contract that we have. and you believe, and people believe in this like it's a Seres Dibros, like it's the Ten Commandments, like it came down from heaven. They don't challenge it. They say, if we challenge it, we will destroy the world we live in. What does that sound like? That sounds exactly like somebody who's religious. And if I challenge it, the difference is, of course, that Hashem won't destroy the world because people don't follow his Torah. He's very lenient. But think about a society that's based on a social contract, that's based on a nation state. If people stop following the rules, and everybody does whatever they want, that's anarchy. It's the end of their life, right? That's the end of the world they live in.
Yeah, but they have a police force.
What?
But they have a police force, which is supposed to...
But imagine that everybody stops, including the policemen.
Mm-hmm.
They also stop. So really the nation state, the idea of nationalism, the idea of reason, a social contract that's based on reason, they took the place of God. That's really what Napoleon did. He took apart the belief in God, and he substituted for that nationalities or states or the state religion. By the way, in France it was a state religion, it was worshipping the state.
Yeah.
For all intents and purposes, that's what it was. It was mamish that the emperor was like God. He was considered a God. I am God. I think he said that. It was like a statement that he even said. That you don't need to believe in God anymore. You just need to believe in me. And modern states, that's, they're not as bad as him, but in China, I'm not sure that that's not what they think.
No, the end of the Russian Revolution with Stalin said, that I created everything.
So that was the aftermath, right? He lost in 1812, 1813, but 100 years later, Marxism, which is pretty much considered to be an offshoot of the French Revolution. Marxism is just phrasing it in economical terms instead of in social political terms, the way that they had done it then. So it took the place, and that's exactly what took over. And you see the ramifications. That was the worst time for the Jews. Why? Because in the end, it's diametrically opposed to faith in God. It's diametrically opposed to being subservient to God. Are you putting it there because we're out of time?
No, just got something stuck in my eye.
Okay. So to truly understand this connection between prayer and sacrifice, it's this consumption, the burning of the sacrifice, which is considered to be the best example of giving composure, meaning giving God composure thanks to His will having been performed. We have to understand this. We know that the soul came down into the body in order to be cloaked in the animal soul. And this is all a descent for the sake of ascent. Before the world was created, God and His name were one thing. Now, that's what it says in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. That's what it says in one of the early midrashim. But Shmo begimatria ratzon. We all know, and this is the way that it was explained. This medrash was explained by way of gematria, by way of numerical value. That Shmo, His name, how is His name different than Him? Why would you say He and His name were one? What do you mean by His name? Yud Kei Vav Kei, that's all you mean. So he said Shmo is 346. It's equal to 346. And Ratzon, will, is also equal to 346. So from this numerical equality, they came up with this explanation. Again, it's sort of like sticking on it, looking for a way to make it stick, and it's fine. That in the end we call it Shmo. It's true, because we've talked about this many times, that in the Tanakh, in the Bible, the word or, light, revelation, is very uncommon. It's a very rare word. The word that was used in the time of the Bible was Shem, was name. So when you said somebody had a name, you meant that he had clout. And what does it mean? That his will is important, that his will has importance in the world. What he wants is important. And it's from the will that the world was created. The world was created to fulfill the will. Because, as we say in Adon Olam, that he wanted his will became to become called king. And a king is someone whose commands are carried out. So, again, the Alter Rebbe here is giving us the reason for the creation of the world. What's the reason for the creation of the world? To have people who do His will. Meaning
it doesn't say anywhere else that you have this only of this korbanos. It doesn't say on other mitzvahs.
Right. I said the only other place is the incense. There you don't even. It doesn't need to tell you because you know that's what it does. But it says something like that. So in any case, why we're still with the question: why are the korbanos? Why are these sacrifices special with regard to everything else? Because all the other mitzvahs also came from this name. They also came from this will. So whenever we talk about the creation of the world, we say the purpose of the world was to be a king. And melech belo am. So we say that you can't be a king if you have no people. So that's the reason for the. Again, there's many reasons. Four different reasons are given, but this is the one that the Alter Rebbe uses whenever he talks about will. He says you can't understand the world, the existence of the world, if you don't understand will. In other words, creation doesn't have meaning if God's will is not followed. It loses all its meaning. Meaning, if people think that they're here to enjoy themselves, so they've lost touch with the meaning of the world. They've lost touch with the meaning of life. And when you look at life as an attempt to enjoy yourself, so life is only pain. It's really only pain. There's never any success. Because as the Baal Shem Tov said, if you had continual pleasure, it's not even pleasure. You stopped enjoying yourself after very soon. So the smart person understands that can't be the purpose of life. It's very interesting that young people understand this to some extent, even though they don't have a lot of experience. Meaning it's very built in to the human psyche, even if you're not 50, 60, 70, 80, and you understand more and more about what is important in life and what isn't. Even when you're 15 or 20, I see my sons, they understand this. I don't know how they exactly understood it, but they have it's not that they don't have this yearning for pleasure also, but very quickly they realize that the pleasure passes. And there's nothing like serving Hashem. They call it to serve Hashem. I mean, that's what we call it. Avodat Hashem. What do you mean, Avodat Hashem? I belong to Hashem. I belong to God. And it suddenly gives tremendous meaning to why life is also short. What do I care? What do I care?
What do you mean life is short? Why is life short?
Why, if the purpose of life was pleasure, why would you die? There'd be no purpose to die. There'd be no reason to die.
You don't get a choice of it.
Okay. So now how are you going to live your life? I need to get in as much pleasure as I can before I die.
Be happy because tomorrow you die.
Okay. So I need to get in as much pleasure as I can before I die. But death becomes the antithesis of life. But if carrying out God's will is the purpose of life, death is not necessarily the antithesis. Not at all. This is also part of it.
But even if you confuse me, because even if you're doing it because Hashem wants, you still want to do it for as long as possible.
No, but he also has, like the Baal Shem Tov said before he passed away, I could theoretically continue to live on. Meaning, he said it, I could go to heaven with my body. I don't have to end my life to go into heaven. But I want to perform God's will, which is afarata ve'afar tashuv. That God said, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. That's also part of His will. And how can you perform that if you don't die? If you don't actually physically die? That also is performing God's will, just as much. It's like the famous, that's why on the death of a tzaddik, on the day that a tzaddik passes away, the first year it's not very happy, but the second year it becomes a day of celebration. Why? Because now he fulfilled the final step in his journey. It's a fulfillment. It's not the end. It's another step that is necessary. It's part of the whole structure. Somebody said, you're just telling yourself that to feel better. Again, it depends what you think life is about. If you think life is about pleasure, you're right. I'm just telling it to myself. The part of me that thinks that life is about pleasure has a problem with this. And it yells out and says, you're just fooling yourself. But the part of me that understands that part is coming from the animal soul. And that's what the animal soul understands. But my divine soul understands a little bit more. So I say, okay, you're right in your way, but I have bigger fish to fry. I have a bigger purpose to my life than just to seek pleasure. And the moment that I understand that with my divine soul, that my purpose is to serve Hashem, meaning to fulfill His will, so that also is part of the will. It's also part of it. Maybe a person should be afraid of putting tefillin on. Maybe it's a terrible thing. You put tefillin on, your brain cells fuse. I don't know. Somebody can have a fear. It's not completely ridiculous. Some people are scared of fasting, for instance. Yeah, they're scared. A lot of people are scared of fasting.
Scared?
They're scared. I'm scared. They don't think they can do it, and they think they'll be deathly ill afterwards.
Yeah.
You've never heard this?
No.
Welcome. They don't fast because they're afraid
They
of
don't
it.
want to fast. Full stop. They don't want to.
That also because they want to prevent themselves from eating, which is pleasure and so on. But Mamsi could be afraid of the mitzvah. I remember Shabbos. Shabbos is a big deal with a lot of fear in it. Keeping Shabbos, what does it mean? That you're not doing your business for a whole day.
No, you're not putting it on the television.
No, not the television. I'm talking about serious people who work. I had a friend when I was in college. He started, was a Jewish guy from New York, I think. He wasn't observant at all. But for some reason, he started coming by the kosher dining hall. He started talking to people. He had some friends. And over the course of a year, he was a graduate student. This guy was, as a graduate student, working for Citicorp. I'm talking about 1988. It was in 1889. He was making $700 an hour working for Citicorp in 1989. Citicorp is a big bank in America.
Okay.
Citibank.
Was it making how much?
$700 an hour for programming.
That's not bad.
That's not bad. And this he was doing like in his free time. He was a graduate student, one of the most brilliant people I've ever met in computer science. And he was building their systems for them in a speed and a depth that nobody else could mimic. He was the best that there was, or one of the best. So he was interested. He was interested in Yiddishkeit. He started getting more interested. At some point, after 2 years that he was with us there, and we talked, and he learned, and he this and that, he said, I'm thinking about Shabbos, but I don't see how I can do it. He used to come to davening in the morning, and then go back to his office and work.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted it. He felt, he saw, he wanted it. He wanted it very much. He said, I can't imagine that I won't work for 25 hours. It's just not going to happen. This is not my life. This is not who I am. This is not what I do. And again, for him, his work was his life. It was brilliant beyond any conceivable thing that I can imagine. Yeah, he used to show us as a challenge, because I understood something about mathematics and computers. So he came to me with like a one-liner. He gave it to everybody that he met. One line. What does this do? Nobody could imagine. You looked at it. It was a long line. It wasn't like 10 characters. It was like, it fit like 500 characters in this one line.
Okay.
It's like, what does this do? What does this program do? It's one line program.
And you didn't know?
You can't know. But in one line, he built a whole database. You can't even begin to understand how he did it. It's like, it just doesn't make any sense. And then he couldn't even explain to me how to take it apart the right way to understand how it does what it does. But it's one line and it builds the whole world. He's like, that was real. So he said, I can't imagine what it would mean for me not to work for 25 hours. It's not me. It's the end of my life. Yom Kippur, he came to, because one day in his life, every year he could, but one day a week, it didn't make any sense to him. He couldn't, it was the end of his life. I remember the first Shabbos that the only way that he could do it was he stayed with us. We had to stay in the kosher dining hall. We decided we'd stay with him for 25 hours. We all camped out to give him a feeling that he's not alone, that he could do this. But he was scared out of his mind. He thought his life would end. And then he went back to work. Motzi Shabbos ran back to his lab, and he calmed down. Next week he came and says, "You guys don't need to stay with me. I'll do it by myself." And from then on he continued. It was like he had to hold his hand. So he was afraid of it.
He became from?
He became observant. I don't know if he became from in the sense that he
kept Shabbos.
He kept Shabbos from that. He kept kosher also. I don't know where he is today. I haven't seen him in 30 years. But I saw that people have fear. It's not just...
Nobel Prize?
There's no Nobel Prize in computer science, but maybe he won the Fields Medal, and I don't know, mathematics. No, he wasn't that good a mathematician. He had something with algorithms. He had a way of understanding algorithms that other people don't. So I saw that you can be really afraid of it. There's a lot to fear. This is not going to be me anymore. Okay, so why do we come to this? Because doing Hashem's will can be very scary. What happens to people who become frum? Is also they understand at some level that until now I was free, and now I'm becoming a servant. But they understand that there's something wrong with this freedom. Not right. There's a psychologist who was a friend of Freud's, and of course had a falling out with him and left. Not named Jung. His name, not named Jung. His name was Erich Fromm, and he wrote a book called "Escape from Freedom." I'm translating it. He wrote "Manos michofesh," trying to run away from freedom. And he tried to analyze why people can't deal with freedom. Freedom is too much.
People want to be directed.
So it's not just that they want to be directed. It's existential. They don't, really in the end, a person who has no framework has no life. People understand this. So the question is just, which framework are you going to take? So this guy, before he started keeping Shabbos, he was a slave to Citicorp. I mean, he called himself a free man because he was making $700 an hour. So what? Hashem tells me I'm making $7,000 an hour. What do I care? That's what's going to make you free. Because you make money, then you're free because you chose it. Nothing. You're a slave to them. You're a slave to your desires. You're a slave to this. All men are slaves to something. In the end, you can't really be free. You need your mind to be a little free. But even there, you can't work without a framework. You have to take some things as axioms, and then you become a slave to them, right? And you develop a system based on these axioms. There's no such thing as a boundless reality. There's no such thing as a boundless existence. You always have to have some limits. So that's what the world is. He's saying, why is the world that way? Why does everybody need these limits? Because that's how Hashem created the world. He created it to be a fulfillment of His will. Before the world was created, He and His name were one, which means we're still on the same page in 12.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking.
Still, before the world was created, everything was boundless. His will was boundless also. You couldn't fulfill the will. What?
Still is.
No, why? He limited the will. The will is the limiting of Hashem's infinite nature. Good. So
that's Simpson.
Okay, that's Tzimtzum. This is the earliest source, even before the Zohar, because the Zohar wasn't printed until the 12th century, 13th century. But the source that was known and the people dealt with was this source from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. It says that before the world was created, he and his will were one. So what happened afterward? So his will was detached. That's called Tzimtzum. What does it mean it was detached? That it was no longer part of the unboundedness, the unlimited nature of God Himself. So the will became something limited. Another way of saying this, instead of using Shem, like we said, name, which equals will, if you use light, so the light that we understand, the light that we receive, the revelation of God that we have, was one and the same with God's infinite light. So there was no finite light. There was no finite revelation of godliness before the world was created. So the world is the revelation of God's finite character, which translates as will. So creation was moving from a state in which God cannot be perceived because He's unbounded, He's unlimited, and nothing that's unbounded. The human mind cannot perceive anything that's unbounded. That's why we can't live in a world without framework. So from a state of nothingness, again, nothingness not meaning that there's nothing there, but rather unfathomableness, incomprehensiveness, we came to a state of somethingness or being. And being is already bounded. Until we came through all the levels of this bounded nature of the will and of creation, we came to this physical reality which is called separate. And here we have the character of the aspect of the attribute of separateness. Something can be separate. Not only you alone.
It's not really separate, but you can still think of it as separate.
It is, right. That's the nature.
We're all part of a Shem.
Can, but you have to go against your nature to understand that. The nature of everything in this world is to be bounded and separate. Everything. The moment you say physical, you mean that there are limits and there are borders between the different entities in reality. In spirituality, there is no such thing. In the spiritual realm, there is no separateness. There's no separation. Not the way that we understand separation. It's only when you get into the physical world that you have this concept of separation. The whole reason that this world was created was for an ascent. So what's the ascent? And if all this is a descent from God's infinite nature to create a finite reality, what's the ascent? So the descent is called yesh me'ayin, being from incomprehensibleness, being from nothingness, as it's translated. So the opposite, the ascent, is the somethingness, meaning the being, returning to a state of being unbounded, which means returning to a state of being limitless. And this is the main ascent. And what do we mean by ascent? He says, this is what causes God pleasure. Why is it pleasure? Because it's the opposite from what the world is about. And in the next paragraph, which we won't read because we've read it many times, he says that the joy, this is from the Maggid of Mezrich explained this principle, that the king enjoys the thing that's surprising, something that's out of the ordinary. It doesn't act the way that everything else is. So a talking bird is much more enjoyable than looking at treasures. Okay? And suddenly you find these great kings interested in some nonsense, like a parrot talking in a cage, much more than why? Because it's out of the ordinary. So this movement up, this ascent, is what causes God pleasure. That's what it means. It gives his soul, it gives him, as it were, composure, that his will was performed. The will is not that there's a separation. That he knows will be performed, but rather that from the separation, his will was that it would become unbounded again. So that when a person reaches a state of being unbounded, that is what gives God the composure. That's the fulfillment of his will. Okay, so we'll continue tomorrow. Have an easy fast. I didn't get to say anything about Yerushalayim. One thing I need to say, very important. There's a lot of people who say, but now we live in Yerushalayim. Look, I'll show you here. It's all built. It's all built. So how can you continue to mourn over Jerusalem? It's built.
You don't have a Beis Hamikdash.
So what? But you're so blind to see how much has already been done? The simple answer is Yerushalayim is the name, not of the city. What is it the name of?
What do you mean?
Everybody thinks Yerushalayim is the name of the city.
So this is the place where the Beis Hamikdash is.
It is the Beis Mikdash. Yerushalayim is the name of the Beis Mikdash. What is it like? So on Shabbos I explained this, but it's like in the Neshama. The Neshama is a general name. Chamesh Shemot Nikru La. It has 5 names. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yichida. But one of the personal names is Neshama. One of the levels is Neshama. The same thing by Yerushalayim. It's true that this is also the name of the city. There's a city, it's called Yerushalayim. But when we say that we're mourning Jerusalem, we don't mean necessarily the city, even though the city is not in great state anyway. But that's beyond it. What we're mourning is the destruction of the temple. And that's what this day starts. The first day in which they broke the wall of the city, and they started moving towards the temple. And then Tisha B'Av, it's the destruction of Yerushalayim itself. And Yerushalayim is the temple, first of all. So all these people who have these wonderful ideas, you have to be happy. Okay, I'm very happy with what there is. But this is not about the city.
Well, Hashem, there's good things. But,
Okay.
That's why we say when Pinchas is at home, everybody's sad. And when Pinchas is away, everybody's happy.
Pinchas?
Yeah.
Which Pinchas?
When Pinchas, when we read parashat Pinchas.
Yeah.
In the time which is fixed. It's in the 3 weeks. Everybody's
Yeah.
sad. When Pinchas is away,
Ah.
we read Pinchas. Out of context, it's in the Torah and Yom Tov.
So God willing, we'll learn tomorrow.
Yeah, Bezrat Hashem.